Good evening. Good evening. My name is Eleanor Hansen, and I'm a junior studying biochemistry here at Hillsdale College. It is my privilege to introduce you to this evening's speaker, Mr. Vivek Ramaswamy. Mr. Ramaswamy is the founder and executive chairman of Roivant Sciences, a biopharmaceutical company. A first-generation American and native of Southwest Ohio, he earned a Bachelor of Science in Biology from Harvard University and a JD from Yale Law School. He began his career in 2007 as a biotech investor at a prominent hedge fund before founding Roivant in 2014. During his time there, he led the largest biotech IPOs of 2015 and 2016 and ran successful clinical trials that led to FDA-approved products targeting multiple diseases. For this work, he was featured on the cover of Forbes in 2015. He has written for numerous publications, including the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, National Review, Newsweek, and Harvard Business Review. Mr. Ramaswamy serves on the board of directors of the Philanthropy Roundtable, the Foundation for Research on Equal Opportunity, and St. Xavier High School. And he's the author of Woke Inc., Inside Corporate America's Social Justice Scam. Please join me in welcoming Vivek Ramaswamy.
Well, thank you. I traveled here from Ohio today. I've grown up in the Midwest, where I was born and raised. Good to be not too far away up north here in Michigan, and thank you all for the warm welcome over the course of the last couple of hours. A bit about me, as you heard, I'm a first-generation American. My parents came to Southwest Ohio back in the late 70s and early 80s, in the case of my dad and my mom, respectively. And we frequently used to ask them how it is that my dad decided to come halfway around the world to Southwest Ohio, to Cincinnati. And he said it was because his older sister had settled in Fort Wayne, Indiana, and he had to find a job to be near her. He was in the GE plant in Evendale, Ohio. That, of course, begged the question of why his sister traveled halfway around the world to be in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the only thing we could figure out was the fact that it is the only U.S. state with the word India contained in the name of the state. So that's the story of how my parents came here, at least the version we tell at home. I'll kick it off with another joke that bookends, along with that first story, the actual, perhaps surprisingly, the subject matter of what we're going to discuss tonight. The second is a joke that I sometimes tell relating to China, actually, and the role of China in the topic we're actually going to be discussing tonight. And so the joke goes like this. Chairman Mao comes back to the Chinese countryside in the year 2021, and he meets a Chinese farmer. And he stops the farmer and he asks him how things have changed since Mao was leaving the country. He said, "Do we still have those food shortages that we used to suffer from back when I was chairman?" To which the farmer says, "No, we don't. In fact, we have the opposite problem. We have food surpluses, so much so that our people die of diabetes and obesity." To which Chairman Mao says, "Very good, very good. But what about those steel production targets that we had? We had a 50-year plan to defeat the entire United Kingdom when it came to steel production. How are we doing on that?" To which the farmer says, "Actually, Chairman Mao, the Hangzhou province alone produces more steel than the entire United Kingdom." To which Mao says, "Very good." But his final question was, whatever happened to that Chinese Cultural Revolution, where that proletariat uprising was going to take things over? Whatever happened to that? The farmer laughs, and he says, "Chairman Mao, we don't do that here anymore. We've outsourced that to the United States." And in between, somewhere in the valley between those jokes, rests the topic of our discussion today. On a more serious note, I'll begin with a personal story that takes me back to 1993, back when I was in second grade at Evendale Elementary in Ohio. And it's a moment that I remember to this day. It's a moment when I first heard Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech for the first time. That was the speech where he said, "I hope my 4 children grow up in a country where they are judged not on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character." And I'll tell you that that dream, it stuck with me. It meant something to me because it was the dream that allowed me to go in a single generation from being the kid of Indian immigrants who came to this country with almost no money to becoming, as you heard in that kind introduction, the founder of a multi-billion-dollar biotech company that I had the privilege of leading for 7 years as CEO. And over those 7 years, we got a number of medicines developed. Several of them are FDA-approved products today. The one I'm probably most proud of is an FDA-approved drug for the treatment of prostate cancer. But I stepped down as CEO of that company earlier this year to focus on a different kind of cancer. Not a biological cancer, but a cultural cancer that threatened to kill that dream that Martin Luther King had 60 years ago. A cultural cancer that threatened to kill the very dream that allowed me to achieve everything I ever have in my career. And that new cancer is explained by the origin of the cancer. One of the things they teach you in science and medicine is that to understand a cancer, you have to understand its root causes first. The root causes of this cancer began not here in the 21st century on American soil, but actually in the 20th century on the other side of the Atlantic. When I think about the two most toxic ideologies of the 20th century, they were, without a doubt in my mind, German Nazism, which was identity politics on steroids, and Soviet Marxism, which was an oppressor-oppressed narrative on steroids. You combine the two, and you get their love child of modern wokeism here on American soil. Now, wokeism is a new secular religion in America whose belief system centers on the idea that your identity is based on your race, your gender, and your sexual orientation. Full stop. It says that America is a systemically racist country, that if you're black, you're inherently disadvantaged, that if you're white, you're inherently privileged. No matter how much money you have, no matter your economic background, no matter your upbringing, your race and your gender govern who you are and the thoughts and ideas you're allowed to have. You're a prisoner of the color of your skin. Now, you don't have to just take it from me. You can take it directly from the high priests of this new religion. One of those high priests is Ibram Kendi, who wrote a book that, despite mine being a bestseller, was a more successful bestseller than mine, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And in that book, he lays out in the very beginning his perspective as a high priest of this new religion that the only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination, that the remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Or you could take it from the high priestess Ayanna Pressley, a member of the Squad, who said it in a different way, when she said that we don't want any more black faces that don't want to be a black voice, that we don't want any more brown faces that don't want to be a brown voice. Let's put aside the fact that I probably don't fit her description of what counts as a brown voice. There's a really clever move in that philosophy. It says that your race is something other than your skin color. Your race moves from being about your appearance to being about your ideas and your ideology and your voice. And when your race is about your voice, then that means that any disagreement with that voice, with that perspective, is necessarily racist. And there is no greater damnation in modern America than to be called a racist. So when given the choice between pledging allegiance to that new religion and being tarred with that scarlet R, everyday Americans choose to bend the knee. And that has created a new culture of fear in our country. Fear of losing your job, fear of your kids getting a bad grade in school, fear of becoming a pariah in your own community. And that new culture of fear has completely supplanted our culture of free speech in America. Now, if you ask me, the best measure of the health of any democracy, especially American democracy, isn't the number of ballots that are cast every November. That's an important part of it, but that's just the final act. The most important hallmark of a democracy is the percentage of people who feel free to say what they actually think in public. And there is little doubt in my mind that we are doing abysmally on that metric today. In fact, there's data to back that up. There's a survey earlier this year conducted by the Cato Institute, which found that over 60% of Americans, this included Republicans, Democrats, and independents in the survey, by the way, over 60% of Americans said that they were afraid of expressing their true beliefs in public because of the current political environment. To me, that is not America. That is not the country that my parents came halfway across the world to join. That is not the country I learned to pledge allegiance to as a kid. That is not the country that I want to see America become. Thank you. Now, the story of how this new religion went from being about one of challenging the system, and make no mistake, there's something about anyone who challenges the system that I can personally respect. Whether or not I agree with them, it takes bravery, it takes courage to stand up to any system and to stand up to any orthodoxy. So the question is how wokeness went from being about challenging the system to actually becoming the system. And that's a story I tell in the book. I won't give you the long version here. I'll give you the short version for those of you who haven't read it. It's a story that traces back to the moment when wokeness merged with capitalism. When it got supercharged with the muscle of corporate power, that is when it became unstoppable. That actually traces back in part to the 2008 financial crisis. I lived the 2008 financial crisis. I got my first job out of college in New York City in the fall of 2007 at a hedge fund right on the eve of the 2008 crisis. And what happened during the 2008 crisis was that there was a credible frustration in this country with the way capitalism had worked in the years leading up to the bailouts of 2008, where bankers got paid a lot of money when times were good, but they got bailed out by the public, by the taxpayer, by all of us when times went poorly. And so what the old left wanted to do, and I'm going to admit this, even though I didn't agree with a lot of their policy prescriptions, I was sympathetic to it. What the old left wanted to do is they wanted to take that money from those wealthy corporate fat cats and redistribute it to poor people for the benefit of poor people. That's what the Occupy Wall Street movement was in part all about. But there was the birth of a new strand of the left right around the same time, right around the time that the United States elected Barack Obama, the first black president of the United States, to office, right around 2008, when many millennials were coming of age, exiting college, entering the workforce. There was a birth of a new strand of the left, a new woke left, who said that the real problem wasn't quite economic injustice. It wasn't quite poverty, no. It was racial injustice and misogyny and bigotry. And I'll tell you what, that actually presented the opportunity of a generation for big business in this country. Because if you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street is a pretty difficult pill to swallow. But this new woke stuff was actually pretty easy. You applaud diversity and inclusion. You put some token minorities on your boards. You muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly in a private jet to Davos, as you heard about earlier today. This is actually a pretty good game. Good work if you can get it. The big banks and big business in this country were happy to lend not just their money, but their legitimacy to this new woke movement. But they did not do it for free. They had an implicit expectation that the new left in this country effectively look the other way when it came to leaving their own corporate power structure intact. And so that's the story of how a bunch of woke millennials got in bed with a bunch of big banks. Together, they birthed woke capitalism and used that to put Occupy Wall Street up for adoption. And that worked out so well for the banking industry on the back of the ire falling out of the 2008 financial crisis that their friends in Silicon Valley on the other coast decided to get in on the act. What Silicon Valley did was they recognized that the biggest threat to Silicon Valley's monopoly power actually used to come from the left. So what they recognized is that the birth of this new woke left presented yet another opportunity for them. They realized that if they could leverage their corporate power to advance the values of that new strand of the left, the neo-progressive left, then they could effectively get them to look the other way when it came to leaving their own monopoly power intact. And again, that trade worked masterfully for both sides, censoring content or moderating in their language content that new woke left wanted to see online. Get it off the internet, but don't do it for free. You effectively expect that your old enemies look the other way when it comes to leaving your monopoly intact. That's the story of how this new game is played. It is an arranged marriage. It is not an arranged marriage of love, however. It is more like mutual prostitution, and the net result of that act was the illegitimate birth of what I call the woke industrial complex, a force that is far more powerful than either big government or big business alone, because it is a hybrid of the two that together can do what neither one can do on its own. A force far more powerful than what Thomas Hobbes envisioned 400 years ago. A force far more powerful than our own founding fathers envisioned 250 years ago when they put in place a system of constitutional checks and balances through a three-party system of government that did not envision a fourth branch of government that operated outside of constitutional constraints to be able to do through the back door what government could not do directly through the front door. And those trades worked so well for Silicon Valley and for Wall Street that the rest of corporate America then got in on the act. That's how you get to Coca-Cola issuing new statements about a voting law in Georgia that make it sound more like a super PAC than a soft drink manufacturer, or teaching its employees how to be less white, as they did earlier this year, to avoid a conversation about their own product's impact on the nationwide epidemic of diabetes and obesity, which, as you guessed, probably affects the black community that they profess to care so much about disproportionately. It's the story of how Nike criticizes slavery 250 years ago in this country without reducing its own reliance on slave labor today to source $250 sneakers from China that they sell to black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. That is how this new game is played. Now, I have some further bad news for you about that arranged marriage, is that in recent years, it went from being a two-party affair into becoming a three-party affair. The third actor who showed up on the scene is none other than the Communist Party of China itself. See, China actually understood this game far more deeply than any of us did. What they recognized was that they could use this new arranged marriage between the woke business, between the woke left and the big business interests in the United States to their own advantage, to turn that into a geopolitical tool to advance their own interests in ways that we actually barely managed to understand as it played out before our own eyes. There's even a Chinese word for wokeness, baizuo. It literally refers to woke left, white progressives in the United States, and they use it to laugh at us. But even worse, they are using it purposefully to undermine our geopolitical standing on the global stage. If you have any doubt about that, I'd encourage you to listen really carefully to what they're saying. Xi Jinping, last year, is pressed by the EU on the Uyghur human rights crisis in Xinjiang, where they have literally over 1 million Uyghurs locked up, enslaved in concentration camps, subject to forced sterilization, communist indoctrination, and worse. And the first thing that comes out of Xi Jinping's mouth is that Black Lives Matter shows that the United States is no better. Now, that's not an accident, because his top diplomat then comes here earlier this spring to the Alaska summit and lectures us for 15 minutes in his opening statement about the fact that China wants to see the U.S. stop slaughtering black Americans, and that China wants to see the U.S. do better on human rights. Xi Jinping then comes back to the UN General Assembly just a month and a half ago, addresses the UN General Assembly, according to his Chinese translator at least, using the word equity and inclusion innumerable times in his address. This would be laughable if it weren't for the fact that our own corporations here are lending him implicit credibility when they relentlessly criticize the United States without saying a peep about China. Take Disney. Just earlier this year, thank you. You take Disney earlier this year, or actually in this case, 2 years ago, Disney says in the state of Georgia, it will not shoot a film if Georgia passes the equivalent of a heartbeat bill, a new anti-abortion statute. Yet just last year, Disney goes to the Xinjiang province of China, literally ground zero of the Uyghur human rights crisis, the epicenter of the enslavement of over 1 million religious minorities on account of their faith alone, and shoots Mulan there, and does not say a peep until the very end of the film, where they finally muster up the courage, you can see it in the film's credits today, that we thank the local CCP authorities for allowing us the privilege of filming here, including the very authorities that are responsible for enslaving over 1 million Uyghurs. The NBA works the same way, criticizing the U.S. while expanding in China. Just a couple of years ago, Daryl Morey of the Houston Rockets dared to tweet, "Fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong." And the first person to come to China's public defense was none other than my fellow Ohioan, LeBron James, who actually defended China and denounced Daryl Morey for daring to stand with Hong Kong.
that is how this new game is played. And you might ask yourself why it is that these corporations and their crony celebrities do it. The answer is actually quite simple. It comes down to money. Because if you're a company here in the United States and you want to enter the Chinese market, the CCP builds a great Chinese wall that prevents you from entering the Chinese market if you criticize the CCP. But they roll out the red carpet if you criticize the United States. So companies are doing what you would expect companies to do, whatever allows them to make the most money. Now, I know you heard earlier today in the 4 o'clock lecture about stakeholder capitalism. Well, one of the origins of stakeholder capitalism actually traces back to a different philosophy in the 1990s, one of democratic capitalism, yet another philosophy that thought we could use capitalism as a vehicle to spread democracy. According to the tenets of democratic capitalism, we could use capitalism as our vehicle to spread democracy to places like China. This was a dominant way of thinking in both the Republican Party and the Democratic Party for much of the 1990s, by the way. Well, what China realized is they could turn that game on its head. We thought we could send Big Macs and Happy Meals to places like China, and somehow that was going to spread democracy. We thought we could use our money to get them to be more like us. What they realized is actually they could play the game back in reverse with a vengeance. They could use their money to get us to be more like them. Or even one step better, realize that they could use our money to get us to be more like them. Send back Nike movies and Disney sneakers as Trojan horses to undermine the United States from within. And I use that analogy intentionally. The Battle of Troy was not won militarily. The walls of Troy were impenetrable to the Greek onslaught for a very long time until they realized they could use the gift of the Trojan horse to ultimately undermine Troy from within. And we here in the United States have accepted the Trojan horse of global capitalism that includes an autocratic regime that's playing by the rules of the jungle while we're here pretending like we're participating in a seminar at Yale, that to recognize that they have used our own companies to be able to create a false moral equivalence between the United States and China. Because when you have that new class of international moral arbiters, Disney, the NBA, BlackRock, Goldman Sachs, Nike, Airbnb, the list goes on. When you have that new class of international moral arbiters who relentlessly criticize the United States, who are known to criticize injustice, but never criticize the actual macro-aggressions abroad, in contrast to the microaggressions here at home, you attack our greatest geopolitical asset of all. That is not our nuclear arsenal. It is our moral standing on the global stage. Thank you. And that game has worked so well that they're now using it to also deflect accountability for the origin of this pandemic by equating any inquiry for the last year and a half into the origin of this pandemic to being liable to an allegation of racism. And I think that if you have any doubt about it, you can even just think about the name of this virus, where you could say the Marburg virus after the town in Germany where it originated, or the Zika virus named after the forest where it came from, or the Japanese encephalitis virus, which, as you might guess, came from Japan, where it originated. You could even say the UK strain, or the South African strain, or the Brazilian strain, or the Indian mutant strain when it came to COVID-19. But if you said the Wuhan virus, you were immediately bashed as a racist and a bigot. Ask yourself why. I think that third actor from abroad, the CCP, has weaponized not just the COVID-19 pandemic, but the woke pandemic, to create a false equivalence between Chinese nihilism and American idealism. And when that happens, nihilism wins every time. Thank you, LeBron James. Thank you, Disney. Thank you, NBA. The real losers of this game, if we're to keep score of this, are the American people. The winners are clear. The CCP wins, woke activists wins, corporations win. The real loser, actually, I think, is American democracy itself. So that is the beginning of a summary of the problem. I understand that you also heard a little bit more about the problem earlier today, and so what I'd like to do is to at least transition the remainder of our discussion towards a beginning of a reflection on what a solution may look like. And I will warn you in advance, there is no silver bullet, but I do think there is a better way forward that spans 4 prongs at least. Spans public policy, driven through Congress, spans our courts, cases through our courts that ultimately can fight back starting today under existing laws, market forces that can begin to restore a balance in the marketplace of ideas by using the market itself as a vehicle to doing so, and finally, most importantly, changes to our culture that begin with changes to the fabric of education in this country itself. So I will talk about each of those in turn. Thank you. Now, before I do, I want to take you back, before I talk about the policy solutions, to talk about one of my heroes, actually, in the conservative movement in 1980, Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, I had the privilege of taking a picture next to, at least his statue, earlier this evening on campus. I'll take that back to my son and show him tonight. He's a big fan of Ronald Reagan as well. Ronald Reagan was one of my heroes because he did what he needed to do in his era. And I want to be the first to say, before I lay out the kinds of solutions I have in mind, I really respect Reagan for what he did, because he rose to the occasion of his time, recognizing that the biggest threat to liberty and prosperity back in 1980 was big government. So he did what he needed to do. He slashed regulations, he slashed taxes, he heralded in an era of prosperity whose echoes we continue to hear today, whose fruits we continue to enjoy to this day, and that is why he's one of my heroes. But I also want to remind you of a lesson we all learned from my favorite Republican hero, who spoke not 40 years ago, but 160 years ago, Abraham Lincoln, when he famously reminded us that the dogmas of a quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. And I argue that the dogmas of 1980 are inadequate to address the unique challenges that we face in 2021. We're going to need new solutions that ultimately meet the new challenges of our time. Let me start with policy solutions, beginning with one of the examples of how we need to separate 1980-style thinking from a 2021-style reality, beginning with the issue of big tech censorship in this country. Now, conventional wisdom would say that these are private companies who are free to decide what does and doesn't show up on their websites. And I agree with that, if these companies are actually acting as private companies. But we now know today that, in fact, these companies are not just acting as private companies. They're responding to threats of the party in power. They are working hand in glove with the party in power. They are even immunized by the federal government itself to do what private parties could not do if they weren't immunized by federal government in the form of Section 230 of the 1996 Communications Decency Act. And so what I say is that if you have a private company that is working hand in glove with government to do through the back door what government cannot do through the front door because of the Constitution of the United States, namely to censor political content, if you have a state action that is really disguised as the action of a private enterprise, if it is state action in disguise, then we need to revive a policy agenda that recognizes that the Constitution still applies. When these companies work hand in glove with the government, are immunized by the government, and are threatened by the government to do what government cannot do directly, then those private companies, too, ought to be bound by the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And there is a really simple solution from a legislative and policy perspective to be able to get there. It involves amending Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. Thank you. Thank you. So I've been told that students are getting credit for this lecture, and I need to make it a little bit academic. So I'm gonna do that. I'm gonna check that box in the next 2 minutes, and then we'll get back to the flow. But I think that this is a policy solution that I think has actually staring us in the face. Where what happened in 1996 is there was a statute that was passed that said that actually internet companies, internet service providers, cannot be sued in the states if they take down content that is otherwise constitutionally protected. The law actually says that, including material that is otherwise constitutionally protected. That's different than C1, which is what you usually hear about when you hear about Section 230, which is what the part that says that a platform is not liable for the posts of somebody who uses that platform. In Section C2, it says that these platforms cannot be sued in the states for taking down and removing content, the kind of thing that you're seeing happening rampantly today. Now, back in 1996, the thing that they had in mind was actually softcore pornography. There was emerging Supreme Court case law doctrine that suggested that certain forms of softcore pornography might enjoy First Amendment protections. What Congress decided to do was to say that whether or not such material is constitutionally protected, when they put that in the statute, that's what they had in mind. We could debate the merits of that from a First Amendment perspective. That was the 1996 discussion. What's happening today, though, is that that statute is being abused to be able to also immunize private companies from taking down content, including political speech, that otherwise would be protected by the First Amendment, something for which that statute was never intended. And by the way, when these companies do it on behalf of the government, is actually allowing the government to sidestep the constitutional constraint on its own behavior. So I say we can turn Section 230 into an opt-in statute to say to these companies that you can't have it both ways. Either you're a private company and you are liable for all of the attendant liabilities of being a private company, and you get to decide what does and doesn't show up on your website. Or you get this special form of federal immunity that blankets you and protects you from liability, but if you do, that comes with strings attached, namely the fact that you're bound by the same constraint as the federal government that protects you, including the Constitution to the United States. You cannot have it both ways. Now, those same solutions, that same principle, I think wakes us up to what I think is a simple North Star of how we revive the Reaganite, Friedmanite instincts that we may be hardwired within our nature to meet the challenges of 2021, to recognize the simple principle that when it comes to the government protection of certain segments of private enterprise, you cannot have it both ways. Those same companies then go to the offline world, and they not only censor content online, but they actually fire employees who may actually defect from their newly embraced orthodoxy. Now, there's a version of thinking that says that that's how the free market works. Well, what I say is that so long as we're going to have protected classes at all, so long as you can't discriminate against somebody on account of their race, their gender, their sexual orientation, or their religion or national origin, then you should not be able to discriminate against them on account of their political beliefs either. Thank you. Yeah, now, I really want to recognize the alternative way of thinking about this, because I used to think this way myself, which is to say that these are private companies, and the last thing we should want to do is impose yet another constraint on how private businesses make their own decisions, that the market should be able to fix this, that if there's these businesses over here that are foolishly firing all of these conservatives, that creates an opportunity for these other businesses over here to hire those conservatives instead, and the market should be able to work that out. There's a certain logic to it. Here's my main issue with it. You can't have it both ways. Either we're going to trust the market to actually police all forms of discrimination and not have protected classes at all, or we're going to apply that standard even-handedly to say that if you can't fire somebody or deplatform somebody because they're black or gay or Muslim or white or Christian or Jewish or whatever, then you should not be able to fire somebody or deplatform somebody just because they're an outspoken conservative or, for that matter, an outspoken liberal either. You can't have it both ways, and this is not an academic issue. If it can happen to the 45th President of the United States, it can happen to anybody. So, thank you. So these are the kinds of policy solutions. I do want to leave some room for Q&A, so I'm going to take about no more than 10 more minutes to speed up through the other prongs of solutions that I think are available to us today. Legal solutions, I'm actually, in the interest of time, going to skip or save for the Q&A. Ways in which you can channel the first parts of what I just said about big tech censorship or firings in the workplace to recognize that Congress probably isn't going to getting around to adding political belief as a civil right and a protected class. They're probably not going to turn Section 230 into an opt-in statute without a new political movement in this country, a new conservative movement in this country that galvanizes it. And I don't see that happening anytime in the next few months. I hope we have a discussion about them in the next few years. There are legal solutions that I lay out in my book that actually borrow from existing Supreme Court doctrines, state action doctrines, civil rights doctrines that recognize that much of what we see happening in corporate America in our schools is actually illegal under existing legal doctrines today. I'll be happy to address more of that in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, to be able to get there, I'll skip that section. I do want to say a word about the role for market solutions in this debate. And I'm going to warn you, or I'm going to presage for you, that in the next year, you are going to see the emergence of a response in the marketplace itself, the rise of platforms that respond to the corporate woke orthodoxy. You're going to see a version of coffee that responds to the orthodoxy foisted on you by Starbucks. Actually, that exists today. It's called Black Rifle Coffee. But you're going to begin to see that emerge in every sector. I think we're going to see that movement in consumer products. I think we're going to see it in financial institutions. I think we're going to see it in nearly every major sector in this country, using the market as a force itself. Personally, I think that some of those could actually be quite profitable endeavors. I think there's a market for it. I think there are 75 or 80 million Americans at least who are disaffected from our private sector today. Some of those 80 million may be sitting in this room today who are looking to at least do business with and be employed by and to buy from companies that do not look down on them, that do not distance them or view them as an enemy. I'm conflicted about it, personally, because I also, speaking as an American, not as an investor, I think some of those may be good bets, but as an American, I'm personally conflicted because I don't want to see the rise of two economies in this country. I don't want to see two forms of coffee, actually. I don't want to see two forms of baseball, actually. I don't want to see two forms of football. If we ever get there, I think that may be the beginning of the end of the American experiment as we know it, because in a divided polity, we require certain apolitical spaces to bring us together, whether we are black or white, whether we're Democrat or Republican, whether we're man or woman, it doesn't matter. You can come together to work in the labs of biotech companies in this country, to play baseball together in the baseball stadiums of this country. That's the kind of thriving private sector we should want. But at the same time, we are not beginning from a neutral ground or neutral territory either, in such a way that as you see those responses emerge, I hope you will join me in hoping for what the eventual next step after that will be. That after a number of businesses successfully take market share from the rest of corporate America, you will have hit corporate America where it hurts most, on their bottom line, and hopefully wake them up to the fact that they had actually messed up over the course of the last 10 years in a way that swings the pendulum back through market forces itself. And so, though I don't want to see the emergence of two economies, I do think that there will be a role to play for private enterprises that ultimately call corporate America's bluff and force them to ultimately normalize a private sector that eventually is restored to its apolitical equilibrium. That's the market solutions prong. Thank you. I want to say a word about education as a bridge to our culture. I was really encouraged, as I'm sure many of you were, about the electoral results that we saw earlier this week. That was, in many ways, led by the parents of this country striking back against a system that's betrayed the education that their children are receiving. Now, with that win behind us, I want to take the liberty of offering some words of advice to the future of the conservative movement on this issue. The first of those is to graduate beyond using the term critical race theory to describe the atrocities that are being foisted upon our children. Because what's now happening in response is we're seeing an intellectual limb of the left beginning to say that actually that's not critical race theory, that's just diversity training and teaching about our history. Beginning a game of verbal jujitsu that I think the left has actually mastered over the right historically, if history is any indicator. What I say is that we should stop describing the ideology of critical race theory by its label and start talking about what it actually has to say in its content. That if you're going to teach kids that they are oppressors or oppressed based on the color of their skin or their gender, I don't care if you call that critical race theory or if you call it Schmittical race theory, it isn't what we want to be foisting upon our kids in the next generation. Now, the second thing I would say to the conservative movement, though, is advice on how we can be even more successful. And I think we also need to graduate from just focusing on, first, what we don't want to see taught in our schools, to talking more about what we do want to see taught in our schools, to begin to see a revival of civic education in this country that teaches our children what the history of this country was actually all about, to weave, I would say, even to weave civic service into primary education on the back of the principle that you don't value something that you inherit. You don't value a country that you inherit. You value a country that you have a stake in building. That we cannot expect our children to love America without first teaching them why America is lovable and for them to play a role in building it forward. Those are the kinds of solutions that I think ought to rise above partisanship and rise to a level of a new, not just conservative movement, but American movement that recognizes that, you know what, as conservatives, we may not like talking a lot about the redistribution of wealth. I certainly don't, because part of what a culture of excellence demands is inequity in outcomes in different respects, as long as we start under conditions of equal opportunity. So I don't love talking about a redistribution of wealth. But I think one of the areas where we can lead the way as conservatives is to talk about a different kind of redistribution that I would like to see in this country. A redistribution of duty. A redistribution of civic duty in this country. A redistribution of duty that recognizes that our shared responsibilities as citizens are born equally. I turned on the TV 4 or 5 weeks ago when that hurricane worse than Katrina hit Louisiana and saw the next morning the National Guardsmen who lifted those people out of those waters. I wondered what was so different about them than me or my colleagues or my classmates. I didn't have a good answer. And I think that that's an area where we as conservatives can begin to lead the way, recognizing that, for example, we have a civic responsibility to bring back our Afghan allies who stood for the values of this country and put their families and personal lives at greater risk than many of us have sitting here, but also to recognize that we don't just bring them to Central Ohio or to Wisconsin or to Michigan. We should also bring them to Beverly Hills, to Silicon Valley, to Martha's Vineyard, to the Hamptons, because our civic duties as Americans are born equally. That begins with education. And education is ultimately the bridge to the longest-term solution of all to this problem, which rests in our culture. And I'll wrap on this before concluding for the Q&A. I think our culture today is perhaps the biggest frontier of all, one in which we have lost our shared culture of pursuing excellence. I actually watched the Olympics earlier this year, watching Simone Biles withdraw from the Olympics at the height of competition, and a media culture that celebrated her for doing it. Just 2 months earlier, Naomi Osaka, one of the top female tennis players in the United States, who did nearly the exact same thing at the French Open, and again, a media culture that celebrated them for doing it. It was a new trend that wasn't just limited to sports. I actually look at the classroom today, where even second-generation Asian American kids are now taught to hide their outward pursuit of excellence in math and science because it's not cool to be number one anymore. Standardized testing being ridiculed as racist. American exceptionalism being off limits as a subject of conversation. What I think is that the inner animal spirit at the heart of the American soul, that wild animal at the heart of the American essence, that animal has been tamed and domesticated by this new culture that penalizes excellence and rewards mediocrity, that penalizes merit and rewards this new cult of mediocrity. And I personally believe that when many of us in this room may have rallied behind the cry to make America great again, we did not just hunger for a single man, we hungered for a revival of the unapologetic pursuit of excellence and exceptionalism in this country. That'll bring me to my final point to wrap up on, which is the question of the void that rests in the mind of an entire generation, my generation included. I'm part of a generation, millennials and Gen Z, including many of the students who are in the crowd today, who are hungry for a cause, who are hungry for a sense of purpose, who are hungry for identity. And we have lost the values that once filled that void, values like faith and patriotism and family and hard work, and in that vacuum are left with the fast food of wokeism. Instead, we are filling our moral hunger with the equivalent of fast food. Going to Ben & Jerry's, getting a cup of ice cream with a cup of morality on the side, rather than filling our moral hunger with more substantial fare. And the question I'd like to end with tonight is a reflection on a question that I think we lack a good answer to today. It's a question whose absence of an answer represents the black hole at the center of the American soul. And that is the question of what it even means to be an American in the year 2021. I don't think we have a good answer to that question. It's a hard question to answer because there's a paradox at the heart of it. On one hand, we all want to be individuals pursuing our own dreams, our own pursuits, our own version of the American dream through our system of free market capitalism. Yet on the other hand, we also hunger to be part of something bigger than ourselves, to be part of a greater whole that is greater than just the sum of its parts. Individualism and unity all wrapped up in one. America isn't just one of those things, it is both of those things. 1776 wasn't just the year of the wealth of nations, it was also the year of the Declaration of Independence. Individualism and unity, capitalism and democracy. America isn't one of those things, it is both of those things. It is a country in which we don't force you to choose between the American dream and the First Amendment, between speaking your mind freely and putting food on the dinner table. We are the quintessential nation where you get to enjoy both of those ideals at once. And in my mind, those were the values that actually won the American Revolution 250 years ago. Those were the values that actually reunited us after the Civil War a century and a half ago. Those are the values that won us World War I and World War II and the Cold War over the last century. And in my mind, those are still the values that give hope to the free world today. And if we can revive those common values over fractious group identity, then I think nobody in the world, not a nation, not a corporation, not a virus is going to defeat us. That is what true American exceptionalism is all about, and that is what we will need to revive in order to defeat this cultural epidemic. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Ramaswamy will be assigning copies of his book, Woke Inc., in the lobby after the lecture. We now have time for a few question and answer. If you have a question, please make your way to a mic, and student questions will be given preference.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. You attended Harvard. My grandfather was on Harvard Medical School staff. Would you send your children to Harvard today?
So my son is 20 months old, so we have some time to figure that out. But you know, it's funny. I attended Harvard. My wife attended Yale. Neither of us was born into elite America. We have lived it for the last 15 years. And I will tell you, when I graduated from Harvard, I was certain that I would want to send my son there. Long before I was married, long before I had a son, I was certain that was a place where I would want him to go because I got a good education there. I got a good education. I got a better education than most of my peers because my ideas were constantly challenged by my peers and by my surroundings. And that was a good thing because the Harvard I went to 15 years ago actually still prized a liberal arts education where the best ideas were ultimately determined not ex ante, but through free speech and open debate as a mechanism for settling a political question. Today, those questions are not settled through free speech and open debate. They're settled through force. And so if Harvard remains the institution that is today, I would not send my son there. If Harvard became the institution or closer, or a lot closer to the institution that it was when I went there, even as recently as 15 years ago, it would be among the places that I would consider sending him, but even still would be somewhat jaded by the fact that an institution could change so quickly in a matter of 15 years from the time I went there to the moment we're in today. But I'll let you know in about 18 years when my son applies to college. It's a good question, and I think it's a question that goes to the essence of this place, too, and I want to take just a second to say a word about that. I actually was always somewhere between curious and an admirer of Hillsdale as an institution. I had a friend of mine from high school who went here for my high school class. He works at Ashland College today, actually. But I always thought it was an interesting place that added to the marketplace of ideas in education. today I don't think it's just an interesting place. I think institutions like Hillsdale are vitally important to the future of our republic. And I think that has become more important because I thank you for beginning to applaud. I'll ask you not to, because I think that this is not just intended as a compliment to Hillsdale. It is intended as a wake-up call to the rest of the country. And if this place provides a North Star and a shining light for other universities like it to pop up across the country, and there's greater competition for this place to attract the kind of students that you're getting, then I think actually that's the best realization of your mission that you could imagine, because our country depends on it. So I want to thank you for inviting me here to be part of this today, because it's not just an institution that I'm curious about or one that I respect. It's one whose very existence I think the American future depends upon to produce a generation of future leaders that we lack today. Thank you.
Questions to the speaker's right.
Thank you very much for your time. Talking about future leaders, what advice would you give to students who are here because they want to go out and make that cultural change? So what advice would you give to them, and what actions do you think they should be taking when they go out into the world and they want to solve this culture problem we have?
So I'll give you two pieces of advice. They're somewhat in tension with each other. Follow both of them. The first is, when you believe you're the only person in the room who believes what you do, you have a civic obligation today to stand up and say exactly what you think without diluting it, without apologizing for it, being civil, no doubt about it, but to be able to say what you actually believe unapologetically. And my commitment to you in return is that if you do it, then most of the time you're actually going to find that you weren't the only person in the room who actually believed what you did. That's my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice goes along with it, actually, is to make sure, it goes with the piece of what I said about being civil when you say it. Being civil doesn't mean apologizing for what you have to say. Being civil doesn't mean modulating what you have to say. Being civil means giving the same courtesy to somebody else in response. And I think one of the difficulties for the conservative movement in this moment, one of the things I worry about, frankly, is the way this culture war ends may not be with a bang, but with a whimper, where each side accidentally joins that same secular church under a different name, adopting the methods of cancel culture in reverse to fight cancel culture, adopting intellectual terrorism as a means of fighting intellectual terrorism, reacting to the victimhood culture of the woke left with a new victimhood culture that competes in a victimhood Olympics about whether black people or white people or Asian people were the biggest victims of all. I think that is a victimhood Olympics in which there is no gold medalist. I think we all lose. And so one of the things that we're going to have to do as a conservative movement is to do the same thing that made it difficult for us to fight the war on terror in the years after 2001. The fact that we cannot adopt the methods of our opponents in return, or it ultimately erodes the very foundation of what we fight for in the first place. So those are my two pieces of advice to you. Fight as an independent, speak up as an independent thinker. Don't do it as a warrior. Do it as somebody who's leading the way for the kind of culture we want to restore in our civic discourse. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. You certainly have the wisdom and the intellect, and most importantly, the charisma. Please run for president.
Very kind of you. Thank you. Yeah.
Quick line. My question involves what you were saying about the separation between a woke and a more conservative version of anything from coffee to social media. I don't see how that maintains back to a market equilibrium when they can just use this great reset and things around it to stamp it out. Why do we see with Gab or Messenger, they just try and shut those down right out the gate. They control the servers, they control the Silicon Valleys where it's held, they control the infrastructure. Why do we even try to entertain the idea that we can make something different when they'll just trip us up at every hurdle?
Yeah, so I want to respond to that question in two parts. The first is, I want to be really clear, unlike a lot of other people who identify the same problem that I do, I am not in the camp of believing that market solutions are going to be sufficient. I wanted to share with this audience a prediction, in part because I'm in some ways at the forefront of seeing many of these opportunities given my prior career as an entrepreneur and investor and writer of the book that I have. I'm telling you that there are a wave of businesses coming, all of whom actually I think, or many of whom are motivated to respond to the corporate culture through the market. I don't believe that on its own is going to be sufficient. I think the legal solutions, the policy solutions, the cultural solutions, solutions in education all have to be a part of that solution. Now, I want to say a word about an empirical observation that I've made. I'm just being really honest here. I think a lot of the right-wing responses suffer from not a political vision or not suffer from a normative vision, lack of a normative vision, but suffer from often a lack of quality, just a raw lack of quality. I think one of the things we need to do better amongst the conservative movement is to hold ourselves to the same standards or better as the other side. I think the fact that there were millions of people using Parler in the first quarter of this year, despite the fact that the product, if I may say it, was shoddy, to say the least, I think is just an emblem of the fact that actually energy and vision are important, but they're not a substitute for raw quality and execution either. And I hope and expect that many of the responses that we're going to see in the second wave are going to not suffer from the same quality deficit as Parler did, because that makes it a lot easier to be canceled in a literal sense for reasons that don't actually relate to the political ideology, but may relate to the product quality itself. All that being said, I'm not even sure that I want that to be the main category of solutions, because I think there's a risk that if it's done the wrong way, it's actually going to not follow the advice that I gave to the last individual who asked a question, which is the fact that we cannot simply fight fire with fire. I'm a realist. I believe that the next step in this may involve building respectable platforms for 75 to 100 million Americans who feel disaffected and may channel their disaffection through our politics. That's going to be worse, rather than actually creating a truly inclusive private sector, not one that's exclusive in the name of inclusion, but actually inclusive of everyone. That is going to be table stakes for moving forward as a country, but it's not a sufficient condition either. So that's where I'm at. I wanted to give you a sense of my more nuanced position on that, because it's different than many people that say that all we need to do is build another app and that's going to fix the problem. I don't think that's true.
Do you think that it's possible for us to actually complete a return march through the institutions, especially turning over public universities? Or are we going to have to rely on parallel structures like homeschooling or honestly even Hillsdale? And then how do we as the next generation sort of balance those two efforts of battle for current authorities versus reinforcing or forming parallel structures?
Yeah, I do think balance is the right word to use there, because I don't view those as existing in a vacuum. I think part of holding existing institutions accountable is the competition of having institutions that actually force the best out of them, be that in our primary education, be that in our university system. Look, I think that actually one of the ways that I favor fighting the teaching of critical race theory in our public schools isn't to necessarily ban legislatively any ideology, but is instead, because I think it's imprecise and very difficult to define, but a solution that actually could be a lot easier is combine transparency, put a curriculum, if you're teaching in the classroom, put it on a website. Maybe even if you could put a camera in the nursery, in the daycare of my 20-month-old, you could probably put cameras in the classrooms of public schools of this country. Combine that with school choice, and I think you get 90% of the way there. Weave in civic service to the country, and I think you're getting pretty darn close to 100% of the way there. What I think is it's going to be a balance of the two, and part of the ways we revive our public institutions and existing institutions in corporate America that have failed us is actually through the mechanisms of competition with transparency and accountability. So that's my short answer to that question. I'm hopeful that that then creates the cultural conditions for what we really actually need at our national core. And I think that that is an answer to the identity crisis that we're in as Americans today. We have celebrated our diversity and our differences for the last 10 years. We're coming off what I call the diversity decade. And make no mistake, I think our diversity can be a beautiful thing. I also think that our diversity is meaningless if there is nothing greater that binds us together across that diversity, or else we're nothing more than a different looking group of higher mammals roaming a common geographic space doing what our iPhones told us to do on a given day. That isn't America. That's a bit of the America that I see, and I think it's going to take institutions like this one, but other institutions that exist outside of the current public orthodoxy to be able to create the cultural conditions for that revival. So thanks for that question.
We now have time for one more question.
Hi, and thank you for speaking here. I know you kind of ran out of time, but I would like to hear about your judicial solutions that you had talked about.
Okay, thank you for coming back to that. So I'll give you two examples, okay? I proposed amending Section 230 to make it an opt-in statute, to make sure that companies don't get that protection, but also get to ultimately be immunized from what doesn't show up on their website while actually evading the constitutional constraint by removing content that's constitutionally protected. I don't think that's going to happen legislatively. There's a case called Brentwood. It's one of many cases like it, which said that actually there's three conditions for finding state action in the behavior of a private company. Either if there's a threat from a government actor to a private company, that constitutes state action in the disguise of a private company. There was actually a related case of a Pennsylvania bookstore owner who wanted to sell a book, a local prosecutor who didn't want him to sell the book. The local prosecutor threatened him to actually prosecute him if he didn't remove the book. And so when someone wanted to buy the book and couldn't from the bookstore owner, the Supreme Court actually said, you know what, that wasn't the decision of a bookstore owner, that was a decision of a federal prosecutor who threatened a bookstore owner, and even though the bookstore owner was the one who took it off the shelf, that's still state action in disguise. So if they're responding to a threat. The second is if there's willful participation in a joint activity. That's the standard set forth in this case called Brentwood, which said that actually if they're working together towards a common goal, that's still state action, and you can't use the private company as a shield. And the third is if you as a private company are immunized to do what government can't do directly. One good example of this is actually a railroad that was immunized by the federal government from being sued by their employees if they did random drug tests of their employees, because government wanted to run random drug tests across this country. There's a thing called the Fourth Amendment that prevents them from being able to do it. So they said, actually, we're going to say any railroad in this country can't be sued by a worker if a railroad or a passenger if they do it anyway. And actually, the Supreme Court said, soundly, in my opinion, that no, you can't do that. You can't immunize a private company to do what you can't do directly. The funny thing about big tech censorship is that we have not one of those three conditions. We have all three of them. They're being threatened at behest of ultimately not censoring hate speech or misinformation as defined by the party in power. They're working hand in glove with the government. That was a conspiracy theory, allegedly, when I first started writing about it 10 months ago. Today, Jen Psaki boasts about it in the White House press conference room. And by the way, Section 230 is actually the statute which meets the immunity standard too. So that's under existing case law. I think you can actually make the case that these companies are already bound by the First Amendment when they act in coordination with the state in the way that they do. I'll give you one other example to be really tight about it, and now you really get your academic extra credits for attending this lecture if you're a student. The civil rights statute. So I said I wanted to see political belief added as a civil right to the civil rights statutes of this country, and I do. I think it would be a good statement of national shared purpose to say that we don't force you to choose between putting food on the dinner table and speaking your mind freely. You get to do both of those things in this country. However, I think in absence of that change, a lot of what we're seeing in this country is already illegal under existing law. The prohibition on religious discrimination in the Civil Rights Statutes of 1964 and Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says that you can't discriminate against an employee on account of their religion, but there's a flip side to it too. It also says that you as the employer cannot force a religious orthodoxy down the throats of your employees at behest of being fired or demoted. Well, that of course then raises the test of whether wokeness meets the Supreme Court standard for what counts as a religion, because I think what is happening day in and day out across corporate America is that they are being forced to bend the knee to that new religion. It is a secular religion, but a religion nonetheless, and the Supreme Court has been crystal clear that even secular humanism counts as a religion for Title VII purposes. And so when you look at wokeness, and I do this in more detail in the book, but there are certain words you can't say, clothes you can't wear, apologies you must recant, excommunication procedures that must be initiated. If you don't recant those apologies, and sometimes even if you do, it's an unforgiving religion, it's a religion without God, it is a secular religion, but it is a religion nonetheless in every sense of the legal test of that word, dating back to a lot of Supreme Court precedents under civil rights statutes that say that actually you can't force employees to bow down to a cross, then you can't force them to bow down to the church of wokeness either. That's an opportunity for people to bring cases under existing law, and I think prevail in federal court today.
Thank you.
I just want to say in closing, thank you for having me. And despite a beginning of this lecture that laid out the problem with clear eyes, which I think we must as a precondition for moving forward, at the end of the day, I'm actually very hopeful for where we go with the future of our country. We have been through an identity crisis before. We have gotten through them before. Ultimately, I think that it is moments like these that cause us to reflect on who we are as Americans, what it means to be American, and just because we don't have an answer today doesn't mean that we're not going to get there in the years ahead. And I hope this catalyzes the kind of conversation we need to be having in the universities, classrooms, communities, and workplaces of this country to revive a good answer to that question, as I believe we will. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to meeting many of you afterwards. Thank you.